Now that we've covered the major events of the 19th century, I'd like to discuss the lead up to World War I, one of the most significant events in world history. While I can't hope to cover every element that went into the outbreak of World War I have chosen 13 causes of World War I. I have chosen these to emphasize the variety of ways in which causation can be determined. Some of these 13 causes are long-term reasons for World War I. Others are shorter term, while the 13th cause is the immediate cause of the war. When I talk about long-term causes, I am talking about those events that made a future event possible. By short-term causes, I mean those elements that made the future event probable. In other words, something major was going to happen. We can't be precise about what that event would be, but something, whether a war, a revolution, or a transformation, would take place. The immediate cause of an event is that which actually leads to the happening. The first cause of World War I wish to discuss is social Darwinism. This is clearly a long-term cause that made a worldwide conflagration a plausibility, even likely. Social Darwinism is the ideology that applied the concept of the survival of the fittest to politics. Social Darwinists maintained that international politics was a competition in which the strong would prevail and the weak would be defeated and ultimately eliminated. Rather than seeking out accommodation, diplomacy, and compromise, social Darwinism emphasized the competition that would lead to the victory of one national, ethnic, or racial group against all others. Social Darwinism would lead to an atmosphere that saw a future war as a positive event that would weed out the weak and benefit the strong. A second long-term cause of the war was imperialism. Over the course of the 19th century, several European states established empires that stretched across the continents of Africa and Asia. This map shows the extent of European occupation of Africa in the mid-1800s. As you can tell, Europeans controlled Egypt, Algeria, and Cape Colony. But for the most part, European colonies clung to the coastal regions of Africa. These possessions could serve as coaling or refueling stations for European navies. Another reason that European possessions clung to the coasts was the fact that European expeditions into the interior usually ended disastrously. This might have been because disease ravaged explorers, or it could have been because the Africans themselves drove the invaders out. Things, though, were about to change rather dramatically. This map shows the extent of European colonization of Africa by 1890. The first thing you notice is the vast expansion of European territories. Apart from Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia, and the American-protected Liberia, all of Africa had been claimed by one European power or another. This scramble for Africa, as it became known, was accomplished as a result of a number of factors. As I just mentioned, diseases, particularly malaria, decimated European expeditions into Central Africa. The discovery of quinine, a substance that prevents a human from contracting malaria, was vital in this regard. Military technology also assisted the Europeans. The adoption of steam-powered riverboats meant that Europeans could use their vast naval superiority against native African forces. Even more significant was the introduction of the machine gun. European armies equipped with rapid-fire weapons decisively turned the tide against African armies. In the space of a decade, European powers gobbled up nearly every square inch of Africa. As you might have imagined, the scramble for Africa led to increased competition between the European states doing the scrambling. On a number of occasions, major European states nearly came to blows with each other over the colonies. One of the reasons the European states fought for and over Africa was the desire for Africa's natural resources, such as diamonds, gold, tin, rubber, and palm oil. Another reason was national prestige. Conquering hundreds of square miles of foreign territory boosted the prestige of European states who, because of the balance of power, had limited options to expand in Europe itself. Printing maps that showed vast territories under the control of one's flag made Europeans confident in their abilities and superiority. British imperialist Cecil Rhodes once remarked that he saw it as his life's goal to paint the map British red. You may also have noticed that Germany acquired relatively few territories in Africa. Those colonies they did gain were mostly the leftovers that hadn't been claimed by the other major European colonizing powers: Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal. Part of the reason for Germany's lack of colonies is the simple fact that Germany was not a unified state until 1871, and they couldn't spend much effort on Africa and Asia when their main goal was to consolidate the European holdings. Nevertheless, this deficit would later haunt Germany in the 20th century. A third contributing factor to World War I were the national unifications that took place in the mid-19th century, specifically the births of Germany and Italy. One of the significant aspects of the national unifications is simply that they demonstrated the growing importance and power of nationalism at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. Also important, though, is the fact that these national unifications disrupted the balance of power established back in the Congress of Vienna in 1815. That balance was predicated on having 5 great powers of roughly equal strength that could balance each other out. Italy had not been included in that reckoning, and if Italy was to play a role in the power politics of the late 19th century, that meant that there were now 6 great powers instead of 5. Even more substantial was the growing power of Germany. The German Empire, at the close of the 19th century, was significantly more powerful than the Prussia that had been included in the Congress of Vienna. This had been demonstrated by the German victories over Austria and France within the space of a decade. It was becoming clear that the old political paradigm was unraveling. A shorter-term cause for the outbreak of World War I were the problems developing in Austria. As we've seen when discussing nationalism, Austria was struggling to maintain its territorial integrity under the onslaught of nationalism. The Compromise of 1867 had largely solved the Hungarian problem, but the Austrians were still beset by nationalism problems in the south and the east, particularly relating to the Slavic peoples there. Losing the 7 Weeks' War to Prussia devastated Austrian military confidence, but that didn't mean that they weren't looking for a military solution to their Slavic nationalism problem. In fact, the Austrians were investigating the ways in which an attack on Serbia, the heartland of Slavic nationalism, as we'll see shortly, could help the Austrian position. One of the more underplayed aspects of the outbreak of World War I was that the Austrians were seriously thinking of launching an assault on Serbia in late 1914, and this was before the tragic events of that summer had even taken place. Austria is not the only state that had a large, restive Slavic population. The Ottoman Empire also contained many Slavs, most of whom yearned for independence. Many of these Slavs came together under the ideology of Pan-Slavism, which was a loosely nationalistic idea that desired the unity of Slavs. In order to understand Pan-Slavism, we first need to realize that there are 3 different ethnic and linguistic divisions amongst the Slavic people. The first group of Slavs, and the ones I've spent most of my time talking about so far, are the South Slavs. These are the Slavs who live in the Balkans, the Croats, Serbians, and so on. A second group of Slavs are the East Slavs. Ethnic Russians are considered the Eastern Slavic people. The final subdivision of the Slavs are the Western Slavs. Poles and Slovakians are considered Western Slavs. Although the Western Slavs will not play a major role in the Pan-Slavism I am discussing here, the fact that these people shared some ethnic and linguistic traits with the Russians helps to explain one of the reasons why the Russians made such substantial claims over these people. Now that I've delineated the 3 subgroups of Slavs, I wish to point out that there are 2 varieties of Pan-Slavism. The first type of Pan-Slavism was the most expansive. Adherents to this belief desired to see the ultimate creation of a Slavic superstate that would include all 3 types of Slavs. Such a state would have stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, and then all the way across Asia to the Pacific Ocean. You can only imagine the immensity of such a nation, and also its great power. Such ideas certainly threatened other nations, although the variety of competing claims within and between the South, East, and West Slavs made these ideas largely dreams. It does bear mentioning that the Russians were the chief proponents of such a superstate, largely because that state would be numerically dominated by Eastern Slavic Russians, who would be able to direct the Slavic superentity to Russian ends. The other type of Pan-Slavism was the desire to see a union between all South Slavs. Remember that in the late 19th century, the South Slavic peoples were split up and controlled by either Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire. Serbia and Romania were not independent states, although they were self-governing autonomous regions. The goal of these Pan-Slavists was to free their South Slavic brethren from the control of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and then to unite themselves into a South Slavic state. Although the first form of Pan-Slavism was largely a pipe dream, the Russians were willing to support South Slavic unity with the hope that such a state would prove to be a firm Russian ally in the future, especially if Russia played an instrumental role in helping them to achieve their goals. The opportunity for Russia to intervene in this way arose with the outbreak of the Russo-Turkish War in 1877. The map on the right here shows the dispositions of the various states at the time of the outbreak of the war. The Ottoman Empire still controlled a sizable chunk of southeastern Europe. The war did not go well for the Ottomans, however, and the Russians were able to take a number of Ottoman strongholds, even penetrating all the way to Istanbul. The Ottomans were defeated, and were forced to make some major territorial concessions to the victorious Russians. Unfortunately for Russia, though, these concessions proved to be so large that Russia's European neighbors feared that Russia had grown too powerful. Bismarck called the Congress of Berlin in 1878 to discuss the terms of the Russian-Turkish settlement, and ultimately to redraw the treaty ending the war. Originally, Russia had forced the Ottomans to grant Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania their complete independence, and to grant autonomy to a large Bulgarian state and to Bosnia. Bulgaria would look to Russia for aid and assistance. The great powers intervened, however, and cut Bulgaria significantly. Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro would remain independent, but Bulgaria was cut by a third, and this territory, known as East Rumelia, was returned to the Ottomans to directly administer. If this were not enough, the autonomous region of Bosnia was given to Austria-Hungary to administer. In other words, Bulgaria was reduced and Russia's influence limited, and Bosnia was handed over to Russia's rival in the region, Austria-Hungary. Thus the Austrians, who had not participated in the war, materially benefited from their inaction. The Russian-Austrian relationship may have been irreparable at this point, but the final nail in the coffin came in 1908, when Austria-Hungary officially annexed Bosnia. The fallout from this event, and the attempted resolution to Bulgarian independence, would play a major part in the outbreak of World War I. When we discussed the Congress of Vienna, I mentioned that no European-wide war would be fought for 99 years after 1815. That didn't mean that wars wouldn't be fought individually between states, and two significant ones would be fought that would lead to lingering animosity between the participants. The Franco-Prussian War, discussed in our nationalism section, not only led directly to the creation of the German Empire, but also to a long-lasting hostility between France and Germany. This wasn't just French pride. The Germans also seized the strategically and industrially significant provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. The French would dream of the return of these provinces, and conflicts over them would play a major role through the first half of the 20th century. The other significant conflict of the mid-century was the Crimean War. I'm not going to discuss the war at any length, but the way in which the war developed led to a number of diplomatic realignments that were significant for World War I. On one side, the French and British joined forces for this conflict, an alliance I discussed earlier. This friendship would develop further over the course of the century. Equally important, Austria refused assistance to the Russians, even though the Russians had sent major assistance to Austrians just 4 years earlier in 1849. This stab in the back didn't destroy Austro-Russian relations yet, but it didn't help. Another major factor along the road to World War I was the alliance system that developed and evolved in the last quarter of the 19th century. The system was developed by Otto von Bismarck, largely at first to guarantee German security. Bismarck was aware that the growth of German power threatened the other European states, principally France. To protect Germany from retaliation, he negotiated the Three Emperors League in 1873. This league assured its members military assistance in case any of the three were attacked. The members were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. The league only lasted 5 years, though, because Russia pulled out in 1878 in the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War. Remember that it was Bismarck, supposedly Russia's ally, who had called the Congress of Berlin that limited Russia's gains in the war. Austria-Hungary, Russia's other erstwhile ally, also betrayed Russia. As a result, Russia left the League, but Germany and Austria-Hungary renewed their alliance, now known as the Dual Alliance, in 1879. Bismarck believed that any alliance between two states was inherently unstable because the whims of one member could force the hand of the other. To that end, then, he sought out a third member of the alliance to replace Russia. Eventually, in 1882, he found a partner. Italy joined Germany and Austria-Hungary to form the Triple Alliance. This pact would last for the next 32 years. German security, though, meant French insecurity. Still reeling from the Franco-Prussian defeat, the French sought out partners in an anti-German alliance. They found Russia in 1895. After all, the enemy of my enemy can be my friend. Russia was a good partner for France because together they surrounded the Germans and can threaten their nemesis on a number of fronts. Up to this point, Britain had remained aloof, but after being spurned by the Germans, they would seek security partners. In 1904, the British and French signed an agreement known as the Entente Cordiale. The two powers began cooperative military games and agreed to work together within their military's command structures. 3 years later, Britain would join forces with Russia, with whom France already had an agreement. This partnership became known as the Triple Entente, to differentiate it from the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. At the same time, Russia did not abandon its hopes in the Balkans. The Russians declared that they were the protectors of the Slavs, a clear slap at Austria, who could be considered the oppressor of the Slavs. As is well known, it was a conflict in the Balkans that would set the system on edge. This graphic representation of the alliances shows how they centered around the Balkans. Although distant from the center of European power, both of the rival alliances had key concerns in the Balkans. This became even more true when Germany agreed to aid the Ottoman Empire against Russia. This map of the states of the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente helps to lay out the disposition of forces at the outbreak of World War I. Both alliances had key advantages and disadvantages. The Triple Alliance was a smaller group of states, but it centralized lines of communication. Theoretically, aid could travel from any of the 3 member states to any of the others without leaving the territory of the alliance. In this sense, it was mutually reinforcing. The Triple Entente was much larger, in population, territory, and empire. None of the members, though, shared a land border. While this may not have been a huge hindrance for Britain and France, it would prove to be one for Russia. How, after all, could Russia be reinforced if that proved necessary? That problem was never truly overcome, and was exacerbated when the Ottoman Empire entered the war against Russia, closing off southern access to Russia via the Black Sea. Another factor in the outbreak of World War I was the German Kaiser William II. William II came to the throne in 1888 upon the death of his father, the founder of the German Empire, William I. William I had worked closely with his chancellor, Bismarck, in the formation and in the establishment of Germany. While it would be unfair to blame William II solely for not being or not having the diplomatic skills of Bismarck, it is fair to blame him for the way he treated Bismarck. In 1890, after ruling for 2 years, William II fired Bismarck. While it is clear that William II wanted to use his own advisors, not his father's, this was also a risky move. He effectively fired the founder of Germany, and the man who had set up Germany's diplomatic network. Unlike Bismarck, who negotiated numerous agreements between Germany and foreign powers, William regularly made public, diplomatic blunders that broke friendships. His speeches often publicly criticized, threatened, or demeaned his rival states, and cut off the possibility of forming new alliances. One of these blunders led to the Anglo-German naval race. The Kaiser announced a massive German naval buildup in the hope of achieving a navy 2/3 the size of the British Navy, which was then the world's largest. The British saw this as a direct threat to their security, and led to a corresponding British military expansion. A rivalry developed that contributed to deteriorating Anglo-German relations. As you've just seen, an arms race developed between Britain and Germany that expanded to include all the members of the Entente and Alliance. The size of each of the great powers' armies and navies increased dramatically. Alongside the expansion of the overall size of the military, the number of military officers and officials also increased. In every European state, military men took prominent roles within the civilian government establishment, and their advice on political and diplomatic matters became louder. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, war began to be looked as a viable or positive option to an increasing number of problems. Thus, war began to be seen as a solution to problems where it wouldn't have been considered decades earlier. Budgets expanded to accommodate the increasing size and role of the military. Across Europe, the average increase in military spending was 50%. Here we can see the expansion in the size of the number of navies. The German naval buildup is dramatically seen between 1900 and 1910. From 1880 to 1900, all the top 5 navies increased in size, but the rankings did not change. Between 1900 and 1910, though, the German Navy jumped from the 4th largest to the 2nd, while the French Navy fell from number 2 to number 4. While this was significant, the size of the British Navy and its overall advantage also needs to be noted. Throughout the period, the British Navy was the largest, but its lead actually increased under the pressure of the Anglo-German naval race. Even in 1910, the British Navy was over twice as large as the German. The next cause of World War I is one that I've labeled élan. The term itself means vivacity, or the energy arising from enthusiasm. I mean for it to symbolize the general attitude adopted by many general staffs concerning their attitude towards a future conflict. Specifically, the attitude of élan symbolizes the prioritization of offensive warfare in the early 20th century. European war colleges taught that wars were won by engaging the enemy at the moment when your side had the greatest advantage, and winning a decisive engagement. In other words, wars were won by attacking. The advantage went to the attacker, not the attacked, and therefore a general staff was encouraged to make a decision as to whether a war was inevitable as quickly as possible, so that you could prepare for the attack. You didn't want to be the military that hesitated and ended up being attacked. As a result, diplomatic efforts to avert a war were hampered from the outset. After all, if an army knew that attacking was what won wars, why would you expend too much effort in diplomacy, trying to stop a conflict? It was better to stall one's enemy using diplomacy while you prepared your enemy to attack your hopefully unsuspecting foe. As you can tell, diplomatic efforts to prevent such a conflict were not given all the attention that they could have been given. Because of this emphasis on offense, both the primary war plans of each nation's military and the ways in which they trained and equipped their armies were designed to aid in the attack. Thus, the armies were equipped with weapons that would be light enough to be carried in the attack. War plans were also specified to show how, when, and where the attack would take place. Another cause of the war was the swift war theory. I have also called this the over by Christmas theory. By this, I rather obviously mean that most European states believed that a future conflict would not last long, and if it began this summer, would be over by that Christmas. After all, armies were designed to deliver knockout blows quickly. Also, recent history spoke to short wars. The Danish War, 7 Weeks' War, Franco-Prussian War, Opium Wars, and Crimean War were all short. The lengthy Napoleonic Wars had receded in popular memory, leaving people with the mistaken belief that wars were necessarily short. Another reason for this theory is the fact that short wars are easier sells. The propaganda value of launching a short war clearly outweighed fears of long, devastating conflicts. It proved much easier to raise large volunteer armies when it was believed that these volunteers would only be needed for a matter of months. The nature of modern warfare also seemed to support the theory. Modern warfare was fought with catastrophic weapons capable of inflicting massive amounts of damage on opposing armies, civilian populations, and economies. Rather ironically, it was argued that a modern war had to be short because of these costs. No nation could withstand the economic costs of a long war, nor could they deal for long with the endless list of casualties plastered over the front pages of newspapers. In this, they were tragically wrong. Rather than lasting 3 to 4 months, the war waged for 4 years, and no nation was forced out of the conflict in its first 3 years. Humans proved adaptable at dealing with tragedy. In 1912, a crisis developed that could easily have led to the war for which each of the great powers had prepared. The Ottoman Empire, which had been soundly defeated by Russia in 1878, had been weakening steadily since then, and had been nicknamed the sick man of Europe. Nationalism had been gutting the Ottoman state, as it had threatened the Austrians in earlier decades. The continued existence of the Ottoman state was growing questionable, and it seemed as if the state was being propped up largely to prevent a power vacuum from developing in the Balkans. After all, the Russians and Austrians were already preparing for a struggle in the Balkans, and the disappearance of Ottoman power seemed to make the situation even more wide open. The Balkans crisis itself began in 1912. 4 of the Christian Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, ganged up on the Ottomans and badly defeated them. As a result, the Ottomans lost almost all of their European holdings. The victors couldn't agree with each other over how to distribute their gains, and a second Balkans War broke out. Nevertheless, the final result of the Balkans crisis and Balkans Wars was that the Ottomans lost a lot of territory, and Serbia and Greece gained much of that. The significance of this for Pan-Slavism should be clear. As I earlier discussed, the Serbs were the leading proponents of a version of Pan-Slavism that sought the union of all South Slavs under one government. The Ottomans and the Austrians had stood in their way. After the Balkan Wars, the Ottomans were no longer a roadblock, leaving only the Austrians standing in their way. And the Austrians will be dealt with. On June the 28th, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, and his wife were shot to death by Gavrilo Princip. Princip was a Serbian extremist who had been born in Bosnia, that Slavic territory that had been absorbed by Austro-Hungary in 1908. When Princip and his fellow extremists learned that the heir to the Austro-Hungary would be traveling through Bosnia and planned on giving a speech on a Serbian national holiday, they launched their plan. The assassination did not go according to their plan, but Princip happened to be placed in a position to shoot the Archduke in the confusion after the initial attempted assassination. Princip was immediately arrested, and it was quickly discovered that he'd been smuggled into Austria by elements of the Serbian military intelligence, thereby deeply implicating that Slavic state. The fallout over this murder and the accusations associated with it will lead within the space of a month to the outbreak of World War I.